technology and that kind of stuff to help refine. I do not like talking with an echo. So anyway, but I just wanted to real quickly just go over, Marianne asked me to go over some. They don't need to see me really, but quick announcement. So you're in the Oklahoma Department of Transportation Training Center. Have you ever been here before? Okay, so a few yeses and a few nos. We are required to provide a few announcements on the facilities. So the ODOT Training Center, state-owned property, you cannot use any form of tobacco on this property. So please be aware of that. Coffee, tea, and hot chocolate, and most importantly, Missy's Donuts from Guthrie are back there on the table. I do not want to take any donuts home, so please avail yourself of those. And all the coffee and hot tea and chocolate. And if you want sodas, they're in the next room across the hall. Restrooms in the middle of the building. So women's head out to the right. It's there, and men's around the corner, opposite. Please do not sit on the tables. If there is a spill, we'll notify a staff member. I will tell you about the tables. They are on wheels, and I've already experienced if you try to push your weight up on the table, they will slide away from you. So be aware of that. So we don't want anybody falling or having any issues with that. So the tables do move, but the chairs do not. They're not on wheels, but the tables are. And then they also asked, they have a QR code by room doors in the lobby. They want us to complete a transportation center satisfaction survey. So if you have some time and can take that QR code, they would just like to have some feedback with regard to the facility and its fitness for what we're using it for and that kind of thing. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to the Director of Water Quality for the Oklahoma Conservation Commission, Shannon Phillips.
All right. Thanks, Greg. And also, thanks everybody for being here. I recognize most folks, but I don't know how well all of the rest of you know each other. So let's do a round of introductions just so everybody knows who's meeting with us here today. And we'll start over at this front table. Wonderful.
And you know me.
All right, thank you. And then should we do a round of introductions of folks on the call?
Yeah, so
how do you want to do that?
Kevin, I can see your picture. So will you unmute and just introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Kevin Wagner. I'm the director of the Oklahoma Water Resources Center at Oklahoma State University. And fun fact, I was involved in the 1998 UWA development. So fun to be back involved.
To have you.
Kylie, I can see your picture next.
Sure. Good morning. Happy Monday. Kylie Denise with the Oklahoma Pork Council.
Bob, I can see you.
Bob Nairn, I'm a professor in the School of Civil Engineering and Environmental Science at the University of Oklahoma and director of our Center for Restoration of Ecosystems and Watersheds. And I'm pretty sure I was on the same committee with Kevin many years ago.
Nuwakis, I can see you.
Good morning, everyone. Nuwakis Weber, Water Resources Manager for the Chickasaw Nation.
Emily,
Hi, I'm Emily Moyer. I work with TNC here in Tulsa. I'm the freshwater program manager.
Skylar,
Good morning, everyone. My name is Skylar Robson. I'm the City of Tulsa Stormwater Quality Manager.
Michael,
Try that again. Good morning. This is Michael Ware with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Regulatory Office. And so it's good to meet and see everyone today.
Seth,
Hey, good morning. Seth Walters. I work for the environmental department at Simmons Foods out of Siloam Springs, Arkansas. Thank you.
Debbie,
My name is Debbie Dotson, Water Quality Officer for the Eastern Shawnee Tribe.
Allison,
Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Schlant. I am the project officer for Oklahoma's 319 Clean Water Act grant with the EPA.
Brian,
Hi, I'm Brian Lewis with the City of Tulsa Stormwater Quality Group. I'm the supervisor over the field services portion of that group.
Michael Daniel,
Good morning. I'm Michael Daniel, EPA's non-point source program manager, technical reviewer. Good morning.
Michelle,
Hi, Michelle Loudenbach, City of Norman Environmental and Sustainability Manager.
Mike Randall,
Hi, I am the Environmental Compliance Supervisor for the City of Tulsa Stormwater.
Okay, did I miss anybody? Okay, cool. And I am Marianne Dantzler-Kyer with OCC.
Thank you, Marianne, for helping me with the technical part. All right. So again, thanks everybody for being here. You heard some references to, this is not the first time that we've done this before. So just as a little bit of background this morning, at least every 5 years, the Conservation Commission has to review its non-point source management plan to determine whether or not we need to make updates to the plan. But one of the tools that we utilize in the plan to help us prioritize watersheds is the Unified Watershed Assessment. And it's actually a process that Kevin and Bob alluded to earlier, was started back in the late 90s as a way to consider the data and information that we had about watersheds, and then choose the ones that were both most important for us to be working on in our non-point source program and other water quality programs as well, but also places where we were most likely to be successful. And so those are the considerations that we utilize in updating our Unified Watershed Assessment. It's something that we generally do at least every 10 years based on new information that's available. And throughout the time that at least I've been involved with Unified Watershed Assessment, we've made some tremendous strides, both in the quality and quantity of data that we have to help us with that process. So this is the first of at least 2 meetings that we'll have about the update to the non-point source management plan. But this one is really just going to focus on the update, this latest update to the Unified Watershed Assessment process. And so does anybody have, before I go any further, does anybody have any questions about the Unified Watershed Assessment process or why we utilize that in the non-point source management program? Marla. Let me ask.
The question is that a certain section of the Clean Water Act, the Unified Watershed thing?
So Marla asked whether that's a section of the Clean Water Act, and no. It's not a section of the Clean Water Act. It was a tool that EPA encouraged states to utilize back in the late 90s as a way of prioritizing watersheds. And the process that we used, which involved input from a lot of stakeholders, we felt was a great way to both present data, but also get input from other folks on prioritizing watersheds. And so one of the things that we've found most helpful with the Unified Watershed Assessment process is that it not only helps us visualize data and the information that we have for watersheds, but it also helps us choose watersheds where we feel like the knowledge that we have about the status of the impairment, what's causing the impairment, but also do we have the technology, do we have proven programs that help us understand whether or not we can actually address that watershed and the impairments therein. And so those are the key components that we utilize that process for. And rather than delaying too much, I think I'm most excited about the process that's been utilized in this Unified Watershed Assessment update. I feel like we have done a more in-depth review of available data and compilation and utilization of that data than we had the capacity to do in the past. And I think that's both a reference to all the good work that partners have done in collecting data and assimilating that within the framework of geographic information systems. And that's really been an asset to us in this Unified Watershed Assessment process. So I want to thank my team at the Conservation Commission for the hours and hours and the timeline that they've put in working on this. Brad Rogers, Dan Dvorak, Joey, Sarah, Carla, and Marianne and Greg, of course, have been heavily involved in review of that information. And so I think you're much more interested in what they have to say about the Unified Watershed Assessment update than you will be in what I have to say. So unless there are other questions for me, I'm going to pass it on to Dan.
All right. Can anyone just confirm in the chat that they can see the PowerPoint? Just make sure before we get started. We're good? Okay. Great. Well, welcome everybody. I am Dan Dvorak. I'm the Technical Director for the Water Quality Division. Pretty happy to be presenting all the work that our OCC team put together on updating the Unified Watershed Assessment. The last update was done in 2014. So what I'm going to do this morning is do a quick run through of kind of the conceptual framework that we wanted to stick to, some of the high level goals. But the bulk of what I'm going to be talking about is getting to what the metrics are that we actually looked at and how that's aggregated into the final score and what that looks like as an end product. Oops. Okay, so first of all, I think everybody kind of has a good concept of what the Unified Watershed Assessment is. But real briefly, it's a planning tool to help identify the watersheds most likely to benefit from non-point source pollution implementation. It doesn't mean we've identified every watershed that would benefit from non-point source pollution identification. This is a screening level tool done on the desktop using available data sets, right? So what it isn't, it's not an exhaustive list. This doesn't exclude areas for conservation efforts. It doesn't exclude places where we could or should work. It's really a planning tool that we can use to help filter down an immense amount of data. If you think about, there's 3,000 or close to 3,000 HUC 12 watersheds in Oklahoma. As of the 2022 integrated report, I believe there's close to 700 impaired water bodies. That's a lot, right? So where do we start to identify the places where we would be most likely to be successful implementing non-point source pollution conservation? All right. Okay, some key concepts, the approach that we took. We felt like we were standing on the shoulders of all the work that's been done. There's this update's been done. I think this is the 4th go around of the update, and the last one being 2014. We felt like the overall framework was really clear, and we'll talk a little bit about how the metrics were put together, but we wanted to retain that. We wanted to update metrics to maximize the impact of the high quality data and the extensive monitoring data set that we have in Oklahoma. We've got multiple partners collecting data. We've got another 10 years of data since 2014, and thousands of data points collected in streams and lakes across Oklahoma. So we wanted to make sure we use that. We wanted to refine the spatial distribution of priority watersheds and target watersheds where we're most likely to see success. We've learned a lot in the last 10 years about where non-point source pollution conservation works best, and we wanted to make sure we're prioritizing those areas. Additionally, in the 2014 version of the UWA, there was a heavy bias towards eastern Oklahoma watersheds, and there was kind of a retrofit at the end to try to make sure we spread out that distribution of sites. We wanted to see if we could solve that issue on the front end in the prioritization itself. Something new for this effort is a list of priorities for protection as well, and this comes to us from federal non-point source guidance to prioritize protection watersheds as well. So that's a second ranking system that we have for this UWA. And then we wanted to be able to make and share that data and make that data usable to all partners and the public to the best of our ability. And Joey, after this presentation, Joey Dyer is going to talk about the work that he did to put together an Our Shiny app where all of this data will be shared, available for download, and easily manipulated. So a couple of the similarities to the approaches we've taken in the past. Again, it's the same goal, right? We want to prioritize conservation in watersheds impaired by non-point source pollution impacts where we're most likely to see benefits from those efforts. It's the same categorical framework, which we'll talk about on the next slide. And then all of those metrics that we've calculated, that we aggregate them, we have a final score for each watershed, and that provides us a ranking for all the watersheds in Oklahoma. And then we take the top 100 and say those are our priority watersheds. A few key differences. We have that protection prioritization as well. We have some new and alternative metrics that really rely on the extensive data that we've seen in the last 10 years. We're truly in the golden age of data right now, and it's a problem of having too many metrics to filter through than not enough things that we could possibly incorporate. And then the last thing is we wanted to limit the watersheds we selected to those with at least 2/3 of the area in Oklahoma, right? The more area outside Oklahoma, the less impact we have. There's activities that we have no control over here. So this is the framework I was talking about for restoration. That's the severity and threat of the impairment, the potential for impact of those impairments on human health and natural resources, and then finally, the potential we have to actually see remediation of those impacts through restoration. And so what does that really mean? Does it have non-point source pollution impacts? Is it important for health and wildlife? And really, in retrospect, I shouldn't have framed it exactly like that. All watersheds are important for health and wildlife, but it's the ones where there's maximum impact to those categories. And can we actually fix the problem, right? And then on the flip side, we have the new protection prioritization that looks at current land use cover and condition, prioritizing places that have the most intact natural cover that's been least altered. And again, that importance for human health as well as wildlife. So is the watershed relatively undisturbed? Is it important for human health? And is it important for wildlife? Again, understanding that all of our watersheds are important for both those things. And just a note, as I'm talking about each of the individual metrics, a lot of them are scored according to this rubric. And so we did this to maximize consistency of scoring across all the metrics where possible. We couldn't apply it to all of them. But just when we're talking through the metrics, if I say it was scored according to the percentiles, this is what it means. 5 points is the highest point allowable for a lot of the metrics. That's going to mean that watershed is going to be weighted higher for conservation efforts. And then it's just based on the distribution of the points within that score. So if we're looking at something like percentage of natural cover, the upper 25% watersheds with the most natural cover are going to score 5, and so forth. Each of the quartiles then gets the next lowest score. All of the data processing, all of the metrics, we calculated data, the metrics, and then associated those metrics spatially with each of the HUC 12s across the state. And that was done in GIS, primarily in ArcPro. And that's kind of just the overall, the background on what our process was. And so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and start talking about what the individual metrics are for the restoration prioritization. So these are the watersheds where we believe there would be the maximum impact from non-point source remediation efforts. So we called this metric 1. It's really just a screening tool. In order to be considered a candidate for restoration, there needed to be at least one impairment listed on the 303D list for that water body in that watershed, either category 4 or category 5. If it didn't meet that criteria, it was not considered a candidate restoration watershed. So metric 2, this was where the bulk of the points applied to each of the watershed came from in a lot of cases. We looked at the 303D list and assigned points to each water body within a watershed based on priority pollutants. These priority pollutants were primarily carried over from the 2014 UWA with some adjustments based on what we know now. But each impairment was designated a point score. So if there was an E. coli impairment on one water body in that watershed got 5 points. If there were 2 water bodies in that watershed that had E. coli impairments, that watershed got 10 points, and so forth. This is a new metric for the 2024 UWA effort, and we're talking about nutrient impairments, right? There's no water quality criteria for the bulk of our streams in Oklahoma, right? We're talking about nutrient criteria only for scenic rivers. And so we wanted to make sure we were able to use all of the extensive nutrient monitoring we do in streams across Oklahoma. We know nutrient impairments lead to other impairments that land water bodies on the 303D list, dissolved oxygen, fish, bugs. And so we wanted to make sure we incorporated that information. So the way we did that is we took our OCC monitoring data for phosphorus, nitrogen, and dissolved oxygen, and we compared the values of an individual water body to the values that we see at other streams in the same region. If 50% of the observations of a particular parameter, say 50% of the observations of total phosphorus, were higher than 95% of the observations in the region, those are water bodies we were saying have the most impact from nutrient runoff. And yes. Yes. So it would be. Yeah. Okay. So the question was, what does region apply to? Is it just Oklahoma? The regions were ecoregions within Oklahoma from our OCC monitoring data. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then the last metric in the severity of threat and impairment category is riparian condition. And this is where you start to get into the immense amount of data and tools that are available out there. The EPA's Watershed Index Online tool has hundreds, if not thousands, of metrics that are automatically calculated and applied at the watershed scale. And we did run through a lot of those. We looked at a lot of them to see if they were appropriate. And this was one that we felt was at the top of the list. and that's riparian condition. So it's looking at the percentage of crop and pasture land within a 100-meter buffer around streams, right? And that's using the 2019 National Land Cover Data Set. We know that the importance of a riparian zone, direct effects on the stream, be it temperature moderation, input of normal organic matter, but also in the ability to slow and prevent movement of materials from the watershed into the creeks, right? And so this is a place where we actually could consider putting this into the severity of threat and impairment category, but we could also put it in the potential for restoration category as well, because these represent opportunities to restore natural land cover and improve non-point source pollution. And yes. I believe that's a USGS derived product. Yeah. And that was scored using that percentile framework that I presented earlier on. So moving on to the potential for human health and natural resource category. Metric 5 is disadvantaged communities. 3 points were given to any watershed that included a disadvantaged community based on the climate and economic justice screening tool available. And then the metric 6 is impaired lakes. And this is something that is pretty significantly different from the 2014 UWA. In the 2014 UWA, watersheds were ranked based on the percentage of impaired segments within that watershed. Some of the issues that arose were trying to equate lake segments with stream segments. That became a pretty big challenge. And when we were looking at percentages, if a watershed was entirely comprised of a lake, those watersheds ended up being ranked very highly, even though there's very little potential to work on the land surface around that lake, because the lake actually occupies the entirety of that watershed. So what we did was we took every impaired lake, we assigned a score to those lakes based on that same priority pollutant framework that I presented, 5 points, 3 points, 1 point. We also looked at visitation and tourism data, how much use the lake was getting, and whether that lake was used as was designated as a water supply beneficial use. Those points were aggregated for the lake, and then every single watershed upstream was then applied a weighted score based on that lake score, based on the amount of contributing area that that watershed had to the lake itself. In other words, if you had a very large watershed that contributed a lot of the area as a percentage to the lake, that would be weighted higher. Whereas if you have a very large lake and there's a lot of upstream watersheds, each one's just going to get a small piece of that weight. And then that metric was then rescaled based on percentiles as well. So by doing that, we were able to actually account for lake impairments, apply that to the watersheds, and hopefully avoid that issue of weighting very highly watersheds, like some of them that you see here, where it's almost entirely comprised of lake area. Metric 7 is threatened and endangered species. For this, we were able to make use of an extensive data set that the University of Oklahoma has at the Oklahoma Biodiversity Information System, which includes an extensive amount of observation of critically imperiled and vulnerable species across Oklahoma. And so what we did for each HUC 12 was we applied 3 points to that watershed if an S1 or critically impaired species has ever been observed there. S2 would get a 2 if it was imperiled, and then vulnerable species were given 1 point. And so for every single critically impaired taxa that was found in a watershed, that watershed was then awarded 3 points. So if there were 3 critically imperiled different taxa in a watershed, that would be 9 points. If there were 2 different imperiled taxa, S2, that would be 4 points. And all of that would be aggregated and then rescaled to that percentile framework as well. All right, so metric 8 is the critical habitat within the watershed. This is largely a carryover from the 2014 UWA, where we looked at critical habitat for threatened and endangered species from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. We did expand that to include some other spatial data sets, important bird areas that the Audubon generates, as well as priority amphibian and reptile conservation areas developed by the park system. Metric 9 was something that we were pretty excited to include because it's a data set that we've developed internally at the Oklahoma Conservation Commission. And that's acreage of potentially restorable wetlands, right? Wetlands have immense possibility and capability of retaining and processing nutrients and other contaminants, preventing them from reaching downstream streams and lakes. And so we have a desktop screening tool where we've actually applied this to every single watershed in Oklahoma, looking at the area of potential wetland restoration opportunities. And that's going to be based on topography, hydrology, geomorphology, soils, as well as potential alterations to flow from ditches. And the scores were applied for this metric based on percentiles as well. Metric 10, this is a new metric for 2024, is looking at the actual area of the contributing watershed upstream. We ranked smaller watersheds higher. These are areas where if you think about the percentage impact for every acre you put on the ground of restoration, you're much more likely to see a benefit in the downstream receiving water body in those smaller watersheds. So anything less than 3,000 square kilometers got 5 points, 3,000 to 10,000 got 3, and then anything between 10 and 20,000 kilometers got 1 point. And the final metric was sampling intensity. We looked at how many times streams in that watershed had been visited by OCC's monitoring team. This gives us more certainty in that those impairments are real. It also is a measure of the presence we have in those watersheds and our ability to do work. And watersheds where we had more than 80 samples collected during 80 different discrete events, those were given 5 points, 3 points for 20 to 79 samples, and 1 point for between 1 and 19 samples collected. So briefly, what wasn't included? Thousands and thousands of data sets, right? And there's lots of reasons why we might not have included those. It might have been a metric that we felt like was telling us the same thing as a metric that we did include. It could have been a data set we weren't sure of how it was derived or where it came from or what the accuracy was. It could have been something that if we applied it to every watershed in Oklahoma, they all would get the same score, low metric sensitivity. We might have felt like it was limited relevance, or it's quite possible we didn't know about it. And so we definitely are receptive to ideas for the next iteration of the UWA. If there are things out there we should be considering, we definitely want to know about it. But there are lots of things out there that we might not have known about.
Excuse me, Dr. Dan.
Yes.
This is Michael Ware. Could you go back about 3 slides, I believe? The one that talked about the wetland, right there, potential for wetland restoration. I just need to get the verbiage down correctly. Thank you, sir.
Is that everything you need, Mike?
That's everything I need, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so there's 11 metrics. We took all those scores, we added them together. Works the same as every UWA prior. And then ranked the top 100 as priority. And that required a score of 38 to be considered in the top 100 priority watersheds. I pulled this from, I think this might have come from the Shiny app. Actually, it didn't, but you'll be able to see this in more detail when Joey presents. And this is all available to look at, play with, download. But if you look at the distribution of red, those are the priority watersheds. One of our objectives was to get a better spatial distribution across Oklahoma. And we felt like we achieved that. There's about 30 to 35 watersheds that are west of I-35 without having to do any kind of post hoc re-ranking based on geography. Any questions about that before I move on to the protection? All right, so as I mentioned, this is new to the 2024 UWA. It's a second ranking, and these are places where we believe the watersheds are largely intact, and they might not necessarily come to the surface for conservation efforts, but these are places we might want to prevent further degradation. So the first metric we had was natural land cover. And this one comes from that EPA Watershed Index Online tool. It's called N-Index 2, and it's basically just a measure of the percent of natural land cover within the watershed, again, based on that 2019 National Land Cover data set. And the scores are just simply based on the percentiles of that distribution. More intact land cover, higher scores. Wetland coverage, the area of wetlands within the watershed, the more wetlands within the watershed, the higher the priority for protection. This came from the National Wetlands Inventory, and again, the watersheds were scored based on percentiles. We looked at watersheds that contained water bodies that were fully supporting the beneficial uses that we monitor for, which is primarily agriculture, fish and wildlife, and primary body contact. Any water body that met those 3 criteria were given 5 points to that watershed. This is something we've been developing at OCC for a few years now. We assign stream scores to every single site that we monitor. It's a letter grade like what you would receive in school, A, B, C, D, F. It's an aggregation of all of the data we collect: water chemistry, fish, habitat, macroinvertebrates. And again, what we're going to do is take the data that we find at a stream and compare those to regional reference sites. These are regionally least disturbed sites. And so that gives us an idea of how our streams compare to least disturbed conditions. So the more A streams that we had in the watershed, or Bs, those watersheds would then be given scores based on the grade that those streams receive. So for example, if we had a watershed that had one water body that we monitored and it received a score of an A, it would get 5 points. If it had one watershed we monitored and it received a B, that watershed would get 3 points. This is the same metric that was included in the restoration prioritization, and the same 3 points were added if a watershed had a disadvantaged community. So we incorporated high quality water. This was a metric that was included in the 2014 UWA. We did separate that out and put in the protection prioritization for a couple of reasons. One, these are areas that are primarily where protection is the best course of action. But also, if you look at where these watersheds are, they're almost entirely in the eastern part of the state. And so we identified this as a potential possible cause for that skew to the east from previous iterations of the UWA. So if it had a high quality water, that watershed was given 3 points. And if it was an outstanding resource water, it was also given 5 points. We looked at observations of fishes of greatest conservation need from the OCC data set. The fishes of greatest conservation need were defined by Oklahoma Conservation Wildlife Conservation Strategy. ODWC has their own ranking for species based on a number of metrics like what we're showing here for watershed prioritization. But tier 1 species are those in greatest need of conservation. If there was an observation of a tier 1 species in a watershed, that watershed got 5 points, tier 2, 3 points, and tier 3 got 1 point. Again, this is the same metric that was included in the restoration prioritization, threatened and endangered species observations from the OBIS data set from OU and Oklahoma Biological Survey. And again, the same critical wildlife habitat metric from the restoration ranking. So with those 10 metrics, again, they were aggregated just like the restoration prioritization. And to be ranked in the top 100 for protection, a score of 22 was needed. You can see anything in blue. These are our protection priorities. And there is a heavy skew towards the eastern part of the state, in part because of those resource designations, but in part also because these are where we see endemic species that are threatened with very limited range as well. Yes. It was just to get to 100 candidate watersheds. So wherever that fell. The question was, how do we determine the 22 for those online? And that was, it was just based on wherever we hit 100 watersheds. And then one thing we debated, but ultimately came to the conclusion that a watershed could be considered a candidate for protection and restoration. There were 3 identical metrics, so there was a little bit of overlap. We decided that this really ultimately added weight to the prioritization for restoration. If a watershed was also listed as a protection watershed, these are places that do have non-point source issues, but there's an extra resource concern, probably due to some endemic species that live in that watershed. And then there were 11 watersheds that were designated as both protection and restoration. So I know that's a lot of technical information to walk through, but hopefully it gives you a good feel for the why and the what of the UWA for this go around. If there are any technical questions, I'm happy to field them at this time. Yes. Yeah, and so there were some that we looked at, and there were some that we probably were not aware of. The question for those online is, how did we decide which data sets to include? And I think it's really just a case-by-case basis on each individual data set. So I think if there are things we should be considering, we definitely want to talk to you today. Anything else? If there's no other questions, I'll pass it to Joey to show you the cool app that he's developed. And oh yeah.
Nutrient monitoring, is any monitoring conducted using sensors that estimate concentration or using discrete water samples?
Yeah, all the nutrient data would come from our rotating basin monitoring program, which is a grab sample that's analyzed in a lab using EPA approved data analysis.
I don't know if you can hear me. That was my question. This is Daniel Livesey. And I was just curious about, your expectation if that's sampling the entire, or the representative concentrations, especially during high flow. Do you ever target high flow events during your routine monitoring?
We typically don't in most of our monitoring. We go out every 5 weeks and collect grab samples. So it's possible that we're out there during high flows. It's possible that we're not. But we do go out 20 times over the course of 2 years, and we have an extensive data set for all of the streams we monitor. So you're looking at potentially hundreds of data points, if not up to close to 1,000 data points on some of the streams we've been monitoring for 20 plus years.
Wow, that's great. I think that's wonderful. I think I've been seeing some work out of Australia and the Great Barrier Reef, and they've been showing that concentrations can change very largely during high flow events. And yeah, it's not a critique. I was just curious, and if you saw a role for that. I know it's more expensive, but
Yeah, Daniel, I think that's an excellent question, and it brings up an excellent point. Right. One of the challenges, as you recognize, is it is very expensive to do high flow sampling, and we don't necessarily have it in a representative way for all the watersheds across the state. And so in making this prioritization, I think it was really important for us to make sure that we were utilizing a consistent data set that we had knowledge about. And so not that there isn't ways that we couldn't utilize that in the future, but for at this point in time, that's one of the reasons that we made this decision.
Yeah, I agree, especially because you're using all these metrics. It's not just based upon the one number. Yeah, I think it's good. Yep.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. I am Joey Dyer, and I work with Dan at the Conservation Commission. Here I have a web app that is meant to be an interactive way to look at the results of the UWA. If you prefer to look through a report, we have that available down here with this hyperlink. We also have the data that is displayed in this web app available as a CSV, and we have the shapefile available too if you would prefer to pull it into your own GIS software and play with the data that way. So what this is it is made to mirror the format of the report. And so we have our priorities up here. First off, we just have an overview, and that shows the top 100 ranking, either as protect, restore, or as both. And you can interact with this map and zoom in on things. Over to the left, this summary is simply just like the kind of an abstract or an intro to what the UWA app is. Over here, we have how to use this app. The main thing I want to call your attention to is that changing this priority requires redrawing the map. And this is built with R, and R is just not great at drawing GIS data. So it takes about 30 seconds for this to load. So if you play with this later, just don't give up on us. Okay, so here we have our restore rankings, and this 38 is our lower threshold. So if it's red, it was top 100. One thing you'll notice are that some of these watersheds are ranked on here, but they weren't a part of that 100% or that top 100 watershed priority. And that's because we applied that 67% watershed threshold in the state threshold afterwards. And we just didn't want to exclude any like interstate cooperation and stuff like that. So down here, we have those three main categories that Dan talked about. So the severity of threat or impairment, the potential for restoration, and the potential impact on human health. And so the way this works is if you have a specific HUC of interest or even multiple HUCs, you can just change the area here. Maybe we're interested in this Cimarron River HUC. This tells us the actual score, the calculated score of that HUC, as well as how these categories broke out. And so here we see the severity of the threat or impairment is the highest ranking category. So we can go over here to the criteria and look at that specifically. And now we can see the breakdown of those metrics that went into that calculation. And so it looks like our priority pollutants were the highest for that. And then that's similar for our other categories as well. So we have our threatened and endangered species, lake impairments, the critical habitat, as well as our disadvantaged communities. And then finally, the potential for restoration. So you see the score for that wetland area, as well as the watershed, which is based on the contributing size or the size of the contributing watershed, and the intensity or the amount of existing sampling and data that's gone into that watershed. And so if we take protect, once again, it's going to take probably 30 seconds for this to draw. Yeah, and I do want to point out that you can select multiple HUCs. So if you happen to manage a reservoir and you want to look at all the HUCs that feed into that reservoir, you can do that. So if we select these three HUCs over here around 10 killer. This gives you the average score of all three of those HUCs, and it breaks out the average scores for each of these categories. And then here again, we can look at the individual metrics within each of these by selecting over on the criteria tab. And so we can see that the stream score was the heaviest weight, but the supporting and beneficial uses also rank pretty pretty high, as well as the land use and land cover score. And so that's really the gist of it. It's really meant for everybody to play with, to explore for themselves. So I'll take any questions if there are any. Yes. So there is a URL to it, which we'll have to share through an email. Yeah, I have no control over the name of the URL. So typically the way we do it is we just share the links around. Yes. Right. So not right now, there isn't. But that's a potential filter that we could add. So if you just wanted to see the blue for the protect, or the ones above 38 for the restore. Yeah. Yeah, we could potentially add that in. I think it was just in that one HUC 12, if I remember correctly. And so the question was, are the scores just based on where we collected the data, or if it applies to all the contributing HUCs? And so we only applied it to the HUC where the data were collected. No, so for this, it's all the data. And so I don't know if it will show the size. It's just a text file. Okay, 218 kilobytes. So it's not a big file to start with, but you can pull this into Excel and you can filter it however you want to and play with it that way. And also, you got to convert these HUCs to a number before you save it, or else it's going to save the scientific notation and you'll lose it. It's something I've learned the hard way. Right. Yes. Yeah. Not from the app. Right. But yeah, this map is just filtering this data set to display what it's displaying. All right. Don't know who to hand it off to.
I'll take it back over because I've remembered some things that I should have said before. So right now you've seen a prioritization of HUC 12 watersheds across the state based on the information that we have available. And I think there's some questions, right, that's run through all your minds about why didn't you use this data, or what does this mean? So first and foremost might be, what if the watershed that my partners are considering as important for having impacted non-point source pollution and want to work on to protect something that is of value to us is not included as the highest priority watershed? And I want to emphasize that this is one of the tools that we use to help guide the non-point source program. It's intended to help us focus on watersheds where we should be gathering the missing information or taking the next steps. And so we used our OCC database to help prioritize these watersheds because we have we're confident in the consistency of that data. I think as Dan alluded to, there's the possibility of utilizing other data sets. But also, this doesn't mean that we would never consider working in another watershed if there were resources available and partnerships available that helped us all understand that this is a good watershed for us to be focusing in. We know enough about what's causing the non-point source or the water quality impairments or the justification for protection of this watershed, and there are resources to address it. So if your watershed is not highlighted as one of the top 100, that doesn't mean that we would never do a non-point or encourage someone to do a non-point source project there. Also, we'll be utilizing this as one of the tools that we use to help prioritize watersheds for development of watershed-based plans. So that's one of the ways that we'll utilize this. That helps then me think about another thing, right? What are some of the other ways that we would encourage utilization of this prioritization? It obviously could be a justification for pursuing non-point source projects in the watershed that included implementation of conservation practices. It could help us prioritize areas where we need more data. It could help us prioritize, lots of different types of projects. So we'll also, as part of the update to the non-point source management plan, be, kind of clarifying how we would utilize this information. So does that jog any, or does anybody have any further questions that we haven't addressed? Scott. So Scott remarked that this is a not necessarily as a subjective assessment as we've utilized in the past, I was paraphrasing, that we've taken the human element out of this process and wondered whether in the update to the plan that we would incorporate a more solidified process for someone who had an interest in working in maybe some of these watersheds to approach the commission with justification for that plan. And I think we've always been open to that, but I think it's a great suggestion for us to clarify that process in the update to the management plan. And I appreciate that suggestion. Thank you. Anyone else or anybody online? Jason. I think that's a great suggestion. And because 10 years is a long time in between assessments. And obviously one of the reasons that it took us 10 years, well, let me back up. One of the justifications that we utilized in determining when is it time to make a change to the assessment process is, have there been significant changes to the 303 D list, right? Do we have massive new data sets, or do we have new water quality standards, or have there been changes realized? And that was one change, but also it is what new data is available that's a better representation, or that we feel fills in some of the gaps that were in the previous data that was utilized in the assessment. And I think as we've all recognized here today that we are in the golden age of data, and developing a process where this is more automated. I can't commit to that, but I think that's a great suggestion for us to review and come up with the potential for whether or not we could do that on a much more frequently than once every 10 years. Brad. So Brad commented that the the utilization of this tool also directs new projects, and so that one factor that should be considered is that we need some time to implement this prioritization before we shake it up and reset the start button. All right, and if we don't have any questions from online or anybody else in the room, Bud. I don't think that we have a map of that I could put up for you, but I think some of the differences we alluded to, right, is that we were most of the highest priority watersheds were the watersheds that were at the headwaters of major reservoirs, right, where a majority of the watershed was actually underwater, and that isn't necessarily the area where non-point source programs can be most effective. Also, there was a somewhat artificial delineation between, or that's not a fair way to say that. We didn't feel like the primary assessment did a good job prioritizing watersheds all across the state. It was focused primarily in the eastern part, and so we made some adjustments to the assessment at the end in order to make sure that we were prioritizing watersheds all over the state. And so I think, as Dan alluded to, this did a better job addressing those without some post-processing. And so our new versus old, I don't. I think that's something that we could look at and summarize for you. I do feel like, in terms of major partners that are and watersheds of concern that have been priorities long term, I feel like most of those watersheds are still represented in the top 100 here, but there's there are some that aren't as prioritized as they have been previously. But I think that's a good suggestion for us to characterize the differences between previous and this one. All right. Well, again, we are available. Please reach out to us if you, like most of you might, after this meeting, think of additional questions that you have about this process. We'll be reaching out to you for the second meeting that we'll have about the update to the management plan after we get that work done, so that we're ready to talk to you about it. And I want to thank everybody for the time that they've given us this morning, and look forward to hearing from you if you have concerns or recommendations. All right, thanks. Yeah, just as further follow-up, we'll check the chat and have a response to those questions or recommendations. Everybody's released. Thank you.